Episode 2 of Ice Queendom brings all of our main characters together as the story truly begins, and we start to see our first real deviations from the original RWBY series. But before I get into that, I will say spoiler warning for those who have not seen Episode 2 of Ice Queendom just yet. I will not be showing the episode or any clips from it in this video, simply images of the episode and analyzing the events that take place. I will leave links in the description below where you guys can go and watch the series on both Crunchyroll and Rooster Teeth first, so you guys can go there and support the series that we all love. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the original RWBY series, this one episode of Ice Queendom summarizes episodes 2 through 8 of the original RWBY series. It streamlines a lot of the things that happen in those episodes, sometimes, in my opinion, a little bit too much, and changes a couple things that are both very, very good and also a bit questionable at times as well. But getting into what happens in the episode, we start off on the ship that everyone had boarded at the end of last episode. Weiss is looking at her scroll and over the information about Beacon Academy, learning that everyone is going to be put into teams after their initiation that day, which is our first real difference from the original RWBY series. Before the initiation, everyone had arrived the day before, and they ended up staying overnight in pretty much the mess hall where everyone set up sleeping bags. They would be put into the initiation and then sorted into teams, given dorm rooms the next day. In Ice Queendom, it seems that everyone was designated to come to the docks at a specific time. Everyone would get on the same ship, and then they would be headed right to their initiation. It really streamlines the process, and it's on this ship where all of our characters first interact with each other, and we're introduced to the other 4 main characters, all of Team Juniper, that are going to be relevant throughout Ice Queendom. I really like how things have been streamlined here, because in my mind it makes a lot more sense with the way that the schools would function. That the initiation would happen right at the beginning, and then they'd be given dorm rooms, and it gives a reason for everyone to be in the exact same place and interact with one another. Now, as Weiss is contemplating the idea of having it teammates, this is when we first see a glimpse of Ren, Nora, and Jean, as well as Pyrrha. And Pyrrha is the one that Weiss recognizes, as she's a renowned fighter who has won tournaments in the past and has been put on the cover of cereal boxes, in particular Pumpkin Pete's cereal box, and that is relevant for one thing later in the episode that I will touch on. Weiss immediately realizes how advantageous it would be to her to be on the same team as Pyrrha. Weiss thinks very highly of herself as well and think they would make an unstoppable pair. But before Weiss puts any of that plan into action, we see RWBY and Yang as, well, Yang is very happy to be going to school with her sister. And RWBY is mentioning something similar to what she did in the original RWBY series, that she's just gonna stick with Yang the entire time. She didn't get to bring any of her friends with her. And Yang in Ice Queendom would love for that to happen. But she remembers her father's words from the previous episode. Something that I didn't mention in my previous review is that Tai, when he was talking to Yang, said that it's great that you two get along so well, but it's not that great for RWBY if she's constantly relying on you. She needs to branch off on her own. So Yang, realizing this, tries to help RWBY make some new friends, and this leads to the first encounter with Blake, which is very different from the original RWBY series, where when they immediately arrived at Beacon Academy, RWBY said, "I didn't get to bring all my friends with me," and then Yang immediately takes off with her own friends, saying that RWBY needs to find her own. I like this change in Ice Queendom so much better because in the original RWBY series, Yang takes off with her friends, just abandoning her sister who skipped 2 grades, literally didn't bring any of her friends with her, and was honestly very rude. Not to mention, those friends that Yang takes off with are never mentioned or heard from again. So, you know, this makes a lot more sense in Ice Queendom. As they encounter Blake, it's pretty much the same encounter from the original RWBY series. Yang tries to start up a conversation, Blake isn't having any of it, and RWBY asks about the book that Blake is reading. Blake tells her that it's about a man with 2 souls, one fighting for control over the other. Foreshadowing for what happens later in the series, but probably not something that's going to be relevant in Ice Queendom. A nice nod to the original series, though. And of course, this leads to RWBY talking about her own ideology and why she wanted to become a huntress in the first place, that she was inspired by those stories, the heroes in those legends that protected the people. Blake responding that the world isn't like some fairy tale, but RWBY saying that's why they're there, to try to make the world a little bit better. I'm glad that they kept this scene in, as it's really important to characterize RWBY and her motivations for becoming a huntress. Before the conversation can progress any further, though, we see a news article reported by Lisa Lavender. I'm glad that they're giving Lisa Lavender some love and that she's included in this, because we really didn't see any more of her after Volume 1 of the original series either, so glad they're giving some nods to some minor characters in the original series. But the report that Lisa is reporting on is about a Faunus protest getting a little bit out of hand when the White Fang got involved. Also mentioning raids on dust shipments, which prompts Ruby and Yang to start talking about the Schnee Dust Company and the rumors that they've heard. How they treat their employees like slaves, and how they're a little bit of a not nice company, a bit corrupt, etc. Which of course Weiss overhears, and this is what actually leads to the conflict between Ruby and Weiss, how Weiss doesn't like what Ruby and Yang are saying about her family's company, and also leads to Blake speaking up against Weiss's company, which then leads to Weiss generalizing all Faunus in a negative light. Something that Blake doesn't take very kindly to, and just states that it shows Weiss's ignorance, that she thinks all Faunus are the same. This tidbit of conversation doesn't actually come out until much later in Volume 1, but it's good to include this here, and it shows the conflict that's going to arise, or at least the tension within the team that's going to arise, especially between Blake and Weiss, and also shows why Weiss and Ruby kind of conflict with one another during the initiation itself. Ruby then tries to start the conversation over, leading to the sarcastic comment by Weiss that is both present in the original RWBY series and here, where she says, "Oh sure, we can, braid each other's hair, go shopping, and talk about cute boys," and points to Jean. Which, of course, being sarcastic, she then turns and walks away from Ruby, and Blake also wants nothing to do with the conversation, leaving Ruby and Yang alone once again. But this also prompts Jean's interest for later on in the episode. Before they have a chance to try their luck at making friends with anyone else, a hologram of Ozpin and Glinda appears, where they explain how the initiation's going to work. They then see an image of the Emerald Forest in the floor, and this is where it's explained that they have to make their way to the temple, find a relic, and then make it back to Beacon Cliff, defeating any Grimm that stand in their way along their path. The ship then arrives at the academy, and all of the students start readying their weapons, preparing for the initiation to come. And this is something I am very glad to see. The fact that we are shown many other students attending Beacon Academy as first years. With the scale of the academy, with the amount of lockers that they have in the locker room, it's meant to house many different students. Not to mention, with only 4 Huntsman Academies in all of Remnant, there's going to need to be a lot of Huntsmen in every single year to, have enough Huntsmen to defend all of Remnant against the Grimm. I'm glad that they're showing a lot of other Huntsmen in training, even though they aren't going to be relevant to the story as a whole, and probably aren't going to be shown much at all, unless in the background. I'm glad that they're doing this extra little bit of world building, which is something that wasn't exactly that present in Volume 1. Most of the characters being just black shadows in the background. This is when Weiss makes her move, trying to sweet-talk Pyrrha into becoming partners, but Pyrrha obviously is a little bit uncomfortable that Weiss pointed out to everyone around who she is. That she is the famous Pyrrha Nikos, the winner of multiple different tournaments, and the one on the cereal box. This is also when Jean cuts in, thinking that Weiss is interested in him and trying to sweet-talk Weiss into becoming teammates. Of course, Jean doesn't recognize who Pyrrha is, and that is what actually piques Pyrrha's interest, but Weiss's attitude kind of drives Jean away at this point. And there is one very notable thing about this scene that I have a feeling a lot of people overlooked. When Weiss tells Jean, this is Pyrrha, she's won all these tournaments, she's on the cover of the cereal box. Jean says he never really liked that cereal that much. Meaning that this Jean is not the same Jean from the original RWBY series. Because the original Jean loved Pumpkin Pete's cereal, to the point where he would send in 50 box toppers to get a Pumpkin Pete's hoodie. They took Jean's bunny away from him. Which, is very minor, but for the rest of the Ice Queendom series, we will all know that underneath Jean's armor is just a plain hoodie. There is no Pumpkin Pete's logo on it. Something that is completely irrelevant to anything that's going to happen in Ice Queendom, but is very notable to the difference in characterization between these two characters. Regardless of that fact, even though Pyrrha agrees with Jean that the cereal isn't really that healthy, she doesn't like it either, Weiss does drive him away, and then the initiation begins, where we see all of the students on their launch pads and sent flying into the Emerald Forest. And this is also when we get our first introduction of some of the deviations that Ice Queendom is going to take. As Glinda and Ozpin are on Beacon Cliff, pondering about what teams are going to come out of this year's batch of first-year students, we see another professor standing next to them. Xion Zidane, an Ice Queendom original character, and he is a professor as well. A professor that we find is studying a particular type of Grimm. It was revealed in the little info session before the episodes were posted that Xion is actually a studier of the Nightmare Grimm, a Grimm that is likely going to be exclusive to Ice Queendom as well. And because of Xion's presence here, Ozpin points out that, oh, so the Grimm you're studying is here as well? And Xion confirms this. But Ozpin still decides to go ahead with the initiation, even though this Grimm that needs a dedicated professor studying it to help the victims of this Grimm recover from its effects, Ozpin still decides to go ahead with the initiation. Now, I understand where Ozpin is coming from when he says that he wants the huntsman in training to be able to handle any situation. That's what a huntsman needs to do, right? Yes. However, they are at the Huntsman Academies for 4 years to be able to learn to do that. Not a single student in the initiation knows anything about the Nightmare Grimm. You know, something that Xion seems to have spent his life as a huntsman thus far studying. It just seems like Ozpin is being a little bit too cruel and a little bit too cold to the first-year students, as Xion's presence there alone is enough of a warning to say that maybe they should call it off and wait until this Grimm is located. But outside of that change in characterization, the fact that we got Xion introduced here is a major deviation from the original RWBY series, and I really look forward to seeing what his character will do in the series itself. Very likely he's going to play a large part in the overall plot of Ice Queendom, as he's an original character to the series. They're going to do quite a lot with him, and I gotta say, I love Xion's character design. The witch aesthetic that he has going on has a nice little parallel to Glinda, I'm finding. And because of that, I'm kind of hoping his character inspiration is going to be the Good Witch of the North from The Wizard of Oz, because we have Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, the Wicked Witch of the West, which is kind of implied to be Salem throughout the RWBY series, and, well, there's the Wicked Witch of the East from the Wizard of Oz books, the one that was crushed under Dorothy's house, but I don't think that Xion's going to be evil in this series at all, and I don't really know if the Wicked Witch of the East is going to play a role in the RWBY series at all, but I would love to know what Xion's character inspirations are. I love the hat that he's wearing. I love the aesthetics of his design in general. I'm really looking forward to seeing where this character will go. But now, after that brief exchange between the professors, we get right into the initiation as we see some of our protagonists land in the Emerald Forest. Unfortunately, the landing strategies that we saw from the original RWBY series just aren't present in Ice Queendom. Most of the characters seem to just fire one shot to offset their momentum and then pretty much just slam into the ground. We see Yang do that and slam into a cliff, we see RWBY do that and hit the ground, and then Jean really has nothing to offset his momentum except hitting a tree. And then as he's falling from the tree, that is when Pyrrha's spear flies out and catches him. So, not really saving him from the brunt of it, just, you know, falling from the height of a tree, which still enough to prevent injury, but poor Jean is still a little bit of a goofball in Ice Queendom. And then the events of the initiation play out pretty similar to the original RWBY series. RWBY encounters Weiss, and Weiss doesn't really want anything to do with her, but upon seeing what her second option would be, Jean hanging in the tree, she goes back and drags RWBY away, agreeing to be partners, and thinking that she can still end up on Pyrrha's team later, since teams are made up of 2 different pairs. Kind of ironic, because if it actually did play out that way, she would still end up on a team with both RWBY and Jean, which I'm sure Weiss wouldn't be happy about, but of course we know that's not how things are going to go. While Weiss is dragging RWBY away and they are bickering a little bit, we see that Grimm are watching them. The red glow of their eyes watching from behind the trees as RWBY and Weiss continue to bicker with one another. Weiss calls RWBY slow, RWBY demonstrates her semblance, saying that she's not slow, and Weiss retorts by calling RWBY a show-off. You know, Weiss being a typical Volume 1 Weiss. she hasn't softened up quite yet, and the Ice Queen is very much still present. And then we cut to Yang as she's being attacked by an Ursa, a much shorter fight than in the original RWBY series, as in the original, there were two Ursa attacking Yang, she was able to take out one of them, and as she was about to kill the second, that's when Blake intervened. In this fight, Yang punches the Ursa once, it lands on Blake's blade, and that's the entirety of the fight. Very quick, very short, and then Blake and Yang are partners. In Ruby and Weiss's case, they get surrounded by Beowulfs, and a similar thing happens as in the original RWBY series. As Weiss is going to prepare her strike, Ruby uses her speed, darts in the way, they end up tripping over each other, and then they have to fight against the Beowulfs that are charging them. Ruby tries shooting at them with her sniper rifle, and it's completely ineffective. The bullets simply bouncing off of their bone masks, not leaving any marks, not even slowing them down in the slightest, which kind of stands out for me because Ruby's sniper rifle is supposed to be a high-caliber sniper rifle, as she so blatantly said in the original RWBY series. So I would think that it would at least be able to pierce through a couple of them, that at least a couple shots might hit the fleshy bits of the Grimm, or that it would even be able to pierce through the bone masks, because it's pretty close range, and although I'm not that knowledgeable about guns, a high-powered sniper rifle at close range should be able to punch through quite a bit of things in its way. Regardless though, Weiss ends up having to take over, using her fire dust to take out the Grimm, and also lighting the forest on fire, which she then berates Ruby, saying that it's her fault she had to do that. But while we see the forest on fire, we see something slink by in the foreground of the shot. Some thorny vines, it looks like, slinking along the ground, and I'm guessing that's supposed to be the Nightmare Grimm. We'll probably find out in a later episode. Again, for context, I've only watched the first 2 episodes of Ice Queendom upon making this review, so I have no idea what happens in episode 3, and of course, no one knows what's happening beyond that, so I'm gonna guess that this is going to be revealed to be the Nightmare Grimm, or at least to be part of its body in some way, shape, or form, but we'll have to wait and see. Weiss then continues to belittle Ruby for the mistakes that she has made. Ruby is just trying to prove herself, but Weiss isn't even giving her a chance, making Ruby more and more frustrated. This is the point when Ruby asks Weiss, "You think you're just perfect, aren't you?" And this causes Weiss to flash back to the time when Winter was talking to her, pointing out the mistakes and flaws that she has. And Weiss says she's not perfect, but she's leagues better than Ruby. And I think this idea of perfection, that Weiss wants to be perfect, is something that might be core to her motivations in Ice Queendom and the deviations that we might see. But their bickering ends up causing more problems than they bargained for. Specifically, a problem from above, as a Nevermore attacks them. And before we can see how that fight ends, we cut over to the temple as Blake and Yang have just arrived. They note that they aren't the first to arrive, as some of the relics have already been taken, and as they take their own relic, we see Nora and Ren arrive. They too grab their own relic, and then Ruby and Weiss arrive, followed by the Nevermore that is chasing them, which is another deviation from the original RWBY series, as somehow, in the original, Ruby and Weiss were able to grab onto the Nevermore and were clinging to it as it flew through the sky, and then they fell to the temple, instead of running with the Nevermore chasing them. Blake ends up shooting the Nevermore and essentially shooing it away for the time being, allowing Weiss and Ruby to grab one of the relics, specifically Ruby, while Weiss used her glyph to protect against the Nevermore's attacks. We then see Jean and Pyrrha showing up, chased by a Deathstalker. And there are a couple very notable changes in the way things happen right at this scene in particular. Instead of Ruby charging ahead to attack the Deathstalker like she did in the original, once again trying to prove that she belongs at Beacon Academy, and prompting Weiss to protect her and say, you know, you don't need to show off, I know you're skilled, we need to act like partners. In Ice Queendom, Weiss just uses her ice dust to protect Pyrrha, once again happy to find Pyrrha and hoping that they can be on the same team. It takes a little bit of characterization away here, as that scene is kind of saved for a little bit later on, but it still seems a little bit rushed. And then it is Blake who says that they should run. The entire purpose of their mission is to receive a relic and then make it back to Beacon Academy. They don't have to kill every Grimm that they come across, which in the original RWBY series was said by Ruby herself. which in my mind was the first moment where she really showed herself as a leader, someone who is logical on the battlefield, knows the objective, and sticks to it. Having Blake say that in Ice Queendom, I think kind of takes away some of the motivation of RWBY being a leader in and of herself, as RWBY in this scenario wanted to stay and fight the Grimm, and it's Weiss who ends up grabbing her arm and saying, no, let's just run. So it does kind of take away from the motivations of RWBY being the one put in charge of Team RWBY. Regardless of that change, though, the fights that we see during the initiation in the original RWBY series take place in the same ways, for the most part. Team Juniper fights against the Deathstalker, and Team RWBY fights against the Nevermore. The Deathstalker fight does have a couple interesting changes to it, however. The first of which is that Jean is the one to charge forward first. He comes up with the strategy they need to get close to it to be able to defeat it. He charges in, blocks a blow from one of the claws of the Deathstalker, Pyrrha blocks the other, and Ren goes to attack the Deathstalker's tail, preventing that from striking Pyrrha and Jean. Ren is able to deal a decent amount of damage to the Deathstalker's tail, but is still flung off and incapacitated from the fight. Jean notices the damage that Ren has done and calls out to Pyrrha, who then throws her shield and fully cuts off the Deathstalker's tail, which it then falls to the ground. Different than the original RWBY series, as the Deathstalker's tail, when it was cut off, impaled the Deathstalker's own head. Something that really didn't make sense in the original because it pierced through the bone plating of the Grimm, something that likely wouldn't have happened from, the tail falling from the height that it was at. Instead, in Ice Queendom, Pyrrha then throws her spear, which pierces the fleshy part of the Deathstalker underneath its bone mask. Jean then calls out to Nora to slam the spear, which, when she does so, pierces entirely through the Deathstalker, and that is what kills it. In the original, Nora slammed the stinger that was piercing the Deathstalker's own head, and that destroyed the Deathstalker, or at least destroyed the bridge that was underneath the Deathstalker, causing it to fall into the abyss and likely die at that point. I like the change to the Deathstalker fight here. It makes more sense, as when a part of a Grimm is cut off from its body, it's supposed to disintegrate just like the Grimm do when they die. So having the stinger stick around long enough for Nora to be able to slam it into the Deathstalker's own head really didn't make that much sense in the original, and I'm glad they fixed that here. In the Nevermore fight, it pretty much happens the exact same way as the original RWBY series. As everyone is trying to fight against it, figure out some way to win, RWBY comes up with a plan, using Blake's ribbon on her weapon as kind of a base, and then Weiss's glyphs and her own semblance to combine them together and launch herself at the Nevermore, using Yang as the distraction. So Yang jumps into the Nevermore's mouth, starts firing a number of shots right down the Nevermore's throat, disorienting it a little bit, causing it to crash into the cliff. Weiss freezes it in place, and then RWBY positions herself to get launched at the Nevermore. This is when we get the scene of RWBY and Weiss talking, where RWBY says she just wants to show Weiss that she can do this, and Weiss then says she has faith in RWBY. She understands that RWBY has the skill to be there, and then they go through with the plan, launching RWBY at the Nevermore. But a slight change compared to the original, the Nevermore breaks free from the ice and starts to fly upwards. So Weiss uses a couple of her glyphs in the air before RWBY gets to the Nevermore to kind of angle her upwards and give her that little bit of extra momentum to wrap her scythe around the Nevermore's neck, and then Weiss creates that line of glyphs up the cliff for RWBY to run up and eventually decapitate the Nevermore. And as she lands at the top, Team RWBY has defeated the Nevermore and has proved that they are very capable huntresses in and of themselves. And we get the final scene of the episode, where Team Juniper has now come together and been announced, as well as Team RWBY. Jean being the leader of Team Juniper, and RWBY being announced as the leader of her own team. Another thing to make Yang very proud of her little sister, but it's also something that doesn't sit right with Weiss, as we see from the expression on her face. But that's not the only thing we see from that image of Weiss. On the back of her neck, we also see what looks like a bit of Grimm corruption. Weiss is likely the one the Grimm nightmare has afflicted, which is going to lead to the deviations in Ice Queendom compared to the original RWBY series. From the little preview that we got before the episodes aired, we kind of got the hint that a lot of Ice Queendom is going to take place within sort of a dream world, and especially with the Grimm's name being the Nightmare, it's probably going to be an alternate universe that takes place in a dream. as most of the alternate versions of the characters were nightmare versions or dream versions of the characters. So I'm curious to see how all of this is going to play out and what story is going to come about because of the Nightmare Grimm, because of Weiss's own insecurities and her own distrust in both herself and the rest of her team. Overall, I really did like this episode. Having all of these scenes in the new animation style of Ice Queendom is fantastic. Everything looks amazing. And I do really like the changes that were made with all of the content before the initiation, with how the characters first met one another, how we were introduced to Ren, Nora, Jean, and Pyrrha, how Weiss's focus was on Pyrrha for most of the initiation, etc. Once we got to the initiation, however, the second half of the episode, things did feel very rushed. We barely got to see Ren and Nora at all, which really leads me to believe that Ren and Nora are pretty much going to be relegated to minor characters in Ice Queendom, which is unfortunate, but also kind of makes sense with the progression of the series and only having 12 episodes, 8 main characters. It doesn't exactly fit as well. Whereas, you know, having 6 main characters with Team RWBY, Jean, and Pyrrha would make quite a bit more sense, because Xion Zidane is also going to have some role to play, is going to be featured quite a bit throughout these episodes, most likely, so it makes sense that we didn't see as much of them, but we also didn't see how Jean and Pyrrha came into contact with the Deathstalker at first, and a lot of the fights in the initiation did seem quite rushed compared to their originals. If you haven't seen the original RWBY series, I highly recommend going and watching the episode 8 of Volume 1, titled Players and Pieces. That is the one that covers both the Nevermore fight and the Deathstalker fight, and personally, I do like the fights better in the original RWBY series than in Ice Queendom, though seeing those fights animated in Ice Queendom is definitely a different experience, and honestly a welcome one at that. As veterans of the RWBY series, we know how the fights originally went, and seeing this new spin on them is a nice treat as well. One thing that this episode did make quite clear is that some characters' overall outlooks on things are changing in Ice Queendom compared to the original RWBY series. Ozpin seems a little bit more uncaring. Knowing that there's a Grimm stronger than any of the first-year students should be able to deal with that's present during the initiation, he still decides to not call it off, in fact blatantly saying that they need to be able to show they can handle any of these situations. That seems a little bit uncharacteristic of Ozpin, and Glinda didn't say anything about that either, so, you know, that's an interesting change to make there. Jean also seems to be much more competent than in the original RWBY series. He was always the goofball in the original, and there is some of that still here, but with him charging in first against the Deathstalker, and him being able to call out the attacks for each of his teammates to make. That was present in the original as well, but here it makes him seem like a much more competent leader, and very much deserving of the role as a leader, even more so than RWBY. RWBY in the original series, they made sure to give scenes that showed her starting to be a capable leader, showing those signs of leadership in the initiation itself. In Ice Queendom, it was really only that she was the one who came up with the plan to take out the Nevermore using all of her teammates' abilities, which, sure, that does show some leadership on the battlefield, but is it really enough to warrant her being made the leader of her entire team? I would still say probably yes, given what we saw in Ice Queendom of each of the 4 characters, each of the 4 members of Team RWBY, but still, I would have preferred just that little bit more to show that RWBY has the mentality of a leader. And I was also surprised to see that in this episode, we didn't get any explanation of aura or semblance or anything of the like. In the original RWBY series, that was all explained during the initiation itself. Pyrrha awoke Jean's aura, talked to him about aura and semblance, which was essentially talking to the audience, explaining what this stuff is, and that wasn't present in Ice Queendom, so I have a feeling we may not get that much of an expansion on it, but again, we'll have to see. There's still one more episode that's out now that I still have to watch, so I'm going to hold off on making too much speculation on where the Nightmare Grimm is going to take us, where the plot of Ice Queendom is going to head, and all of the changes that we will see. But I will say one thing. The fact that Weiss's focus on Pyrrha was something more prevalent in this episode compared to the original RWBY series. That even by the time the Deathstalker arrived, Weiss was still hoping that Pyrrha would be on the same team as her, that she was still fixated on Pyrrha. This makes me think that if it does go the route of everything becoming a dream, and this being Weiss's nightmare that everyone is going to have to enter, or it's going to be that alternate world, etc., with Weiss's view of Pyrrha, that she is this unstoppable warrior, that she is someone that she wants to be friends with and sees pretty much as an equal, I guess, this might explain why Pyrrha is going to play more of a prominent role in Ice Queendom, something that I'm very much looking forward to, and might also explain her alternate outfit design looking very similar to Weiss's Volume 5 design from the original series. So, you know, things I'm thinking about as I'm watching more of Ice Queendom, and I really look forward to seeing the next episode. Make sure you let me know down in the comments below what you guys thought of this episode, and where you think Ice Queendom is going with the plot, what you think of Xion Ziden, the new original character introduced to Ice Queendom. I love his design, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what his character is going to do in Ice Queendom. I have a feeling he might not show up in the original RWBY series because, well, you know, we've already been through 3 kingdoms in the original RWBY series, and he's not been mentioned or heard of whatsoever, so it would be kind of jarring to just introduce him out of nowhere, but perhaps he's still helping at Beacon Academy while everything else is going on. So I'm curious to know what you guys think of both Xion, the Nightmare Grim, and the changes that were made in this episode. Did it feel rushed to you? Do you like a lot of the changes that were made? Some of them? None of them? Let me know down below. If you guys did enjoy this video and want to see more like it, more RWBY content, RWBY theories, and Ice Queendom coverage in general, make sure to subscribe and join the Guilds of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.